pod hit the ground so hard that my teeth rattled, and before the smoke even cleared, something the size of a transport truck was already screaming outside the hatch. My name is Callum Reyes, and 30 seconds after landing on a planet I had never heard of, I already understood one thing clearly. Nobody sent me here to survive. They sent me here to disappear. The hatch had been torn half off by the crash, so I did not even get the mercy of stepping out on my own terms. Light poured in sideways, along with dust, heat, and the low growl of something enormous moving just beyond the tree line. I grabbed the only thing within reach, a dented case of tools bolted under my seat, and rolled out of the pod into wet red grass a second before a clawed limb the size of a shuttle wing crashed down where my head had just been. I did not scream. I did not have time to. I just ran. Behind me I heard other pods hissing open, other voices shouting in languages my translator implant strained to catch up with. I was not alone on this drop. Scattered across the crash site were other exiles, other prisoners of whatever system had decided we were worth less than the fuel it cost to keep us alive. Most of them were not human. In fact, as far as I could tell in that first chaotic minute, I might have been the only human anywhere on this planet. That should have terrified me more than it did. Instead, somewhere underneath the panic, a small, stubborn part of my brain was already doing what it always did under pressure. It was counting. Counting the creature's stride length, counting the seconds between its roars, counting the gaps in the tree line where the ground dipped low enough to hide a person. I dove into one of those gaps just as the beast's tail swept through the space where I had been standing, snapping trees like twigs. I pressed myself into the mud, tool case clutched to my chest, and I did not move for a long time. When the ground finally stopped shaking, I lifted my head and looked around at the wreckage of my new life. Broken pods, burning grass, and scattered across the clearing, maybe a dozen other survivors, each one taller, stronger, or more heavily armored than me. A four-armed giant with plated gray skin. A lean silver-furred creature with retractable claws longer than my fingers. Something with too many eyes that I decided not to look at directly. None of them looked at me twice. Why would they? To every single one of them, I was the weakest thing that had landed on this planet that day. I did not argue with that assessment. I simply got to work. The four-armed giant was the first to speak to me. 3 days later, though speak might be generous, his name, I would later learn, was Threx, and the sound he made when he found me rigging a low fence of sharpened branches around a shallow cave was somewhere between a laugh and a growl. He asked, through the universal translator crackling in his collar, why a creature with no claws and no armor was wasting its last days building a fence a real predator would step over without slowing down. I told him the fence was not for the big predators. It was for the little ones, the pack hunters that came at night in groups of 6 or 7 and worked together to bring down anything alone. I had watched them for 2 nights already. I had noticed they always circled from the downwind side. I had noticed they never crossed open ground with sharp stones on it, because their paws were soft and they avoided pain. So I had lined the open ground with sharp stones and left the fence as a second line they had never seen before. Threx did not laugh again. He looked at the fence for a long moment, and then he looked at me differently. That night, the pack hunters came, right on schedule. I heard their yips and snarls hit the stone line and stop, confused, circling, searching for another way in that did not exist. By the time they gave up and retreated, Threx had moved his own sleeping spot 10 feet closer to mine. Word travels strangely on a planet with no cities and no roads, but it travels. Within a week, exiles from 3 other crash sites had heard that the soft-skinned human who could not fight had somehow survived a full pack hunter siege without losing a single person in his shelter. Some of them came to see for themselves. Most expected to find me dead, or worse, to find that the story had been exaggerated by desperate creatures grasping at any hope in a place designed to kill them. Instead, they found me boiling water over a fire pit lined with flat stones, water I had first run through a filter of sand, charcoal, and cloth scraps torn from my old uniform. A lean, sharp-eyed woman named Priya, an engineer exiled from a mining colony 3 systems away, was the first of the newcomers to ask me directly what I thought I was doing. I told her I was trying not to die of the parasites in the river water, the same way half her crash site apparently already had. She went very quiet after that. By the end of the 2nd week, my little cave and its stone-lined perimeter had become something else entirely. It had become a camp. 17 exiles from 4 different species, none of whom had asked to be here, none of whom had any particular reason to trust one another, had somehow ended up sleeping within shouting distance of a human who did not have a single natural weapon to his name. I was not naive about why. I had no illusions that I had earned their respect through strength, because I had none to offer. What I had was information, and on a world built to erase you before you understood the rules, information was worth more than claws. Not everyone was impressed. Kalos arrived on the 10th day, and I knew trouble the moment I saw him. He was built like a soldier because he had been one, a former officer from a fallen empire's military, exiled for a failed coup, rather than any crime against ordinary people. He had scars and patterns too deliberate to be accidents, and a presence that made even Threx stand a little straighter. He looked at our camp, at the stone-lined ground and the filtered water and the woven branch walls, and he asked the only question that seemed to matter to him. Who decided the small soft one gives the orders here? Nobody had decided anything, not formally, but the question hung in the air anyway, because he was right that something like leadership had quietly formed around me without anyone voting on it. I did not raise my voice. I did not puff myself up the way I had seen some of the others do when challenged. I simply asked him a question back. I asked him how many of his own crash site had survived the first week. His silence told me everything. Out of the 11 who had landed with him, only 4 remained. I told him I was not interested in commanding anyone. I was interested in staying alive, and I had found that staying alive got easier when people shared what they knew instead of hiding it out of pride. If he wanted to test that theory his own way, the door out of camp was wide open, and nobody would stop him. He left that night, taking his 4 surviving companions with him. I did not chase him. I did not need to. I had learned enough about this planet by then to know that pride killed faster than any monster did. 3 days later, half of what remained of his group came crawling back into camp at dawn, exhausted, injured, and missing 2 more of their number to a night creature none of them had known to watch for. I did not gloat. I simply handed them water and pointed them toward the stone perimeter and let the fence speak for itself. Kalos came back too, eventually, though it took him longer than the others. When he finally returned, he did not apologize because creatures like him rarely did. Instead, he sat by my fire, watched me sketch monster migration patterns into the dirt with a stick, and asked what the marks meant. I explained that I had been tracking which direction the largest predators moved at dawn and dusk for the last 2 weeks. There was a pattern. There was always a pattern, if you were patient enough to look for one instead of assuming the world was too chaotic to understand. He studied the marks for a long time. Then he asked if I would teach him how to read them. That, more than anything else that happened in those first weeks, was the moment I realized something had shifted. Not because one proud soldier had softened toward me, but because he had chosen curiosity over combat. And on this planet, that choice alone might be the difference between species that survived and species that did not. By the 3rd week, our camp had grown to nearly 40 exiles, spread across 5 species I could name, and at least 2 more I still struggled to properly identify. We had a working water filtration line. We had early warning signals made from strung shells and loose stones that rattled when disturbed in the dark. We had, for the first time since any of us had landed on this planet, something that felt less like a death sentence and more like a settlement. I was cautious about that feeling. I had grown up hearing enough stories to know that comfort was usually the universe's way of setting up the next disaster. The disaster arrived on the 22nd day, in the form of Priya running into camp at a dead sprint, gasping out a single word between breaths. Something enormous, something she had never seen before, was moving through the eastern valley, and it was heading directly toward us. I climbed the tallest ridge near camp with Threx and Kalos beside me, and what I saw made my stomach drop somewhere near my boots. It was not like the other predators. Those were large, dangerous territorial animals, the kind you could study, predict, and route around if you understood their habits. This was different. This creature moved with a strange, deliberate purpose, cutting a straight line through terrain that should have slowed anything its size, crushing everything in its path without pausing to feed or rest. Its skin had a faint metallic sheen that caught the light wrong, almost as if something about it had been altered rather than simply grown. Priya, who had spent years around industrial machinery before her exile, was the one who put the pieces together first. She said quietly that no natural creature moved like that. Something about its gait was too consistent, too efficient, like a machine wearing the shape of a monster. I thought about the Confederation dropping us on this world with no warning, no supplies beyond bare minimums, and no explanation beyond a single word stamped on our transfer files: culling. At the time I had assumed it simply meant we were being discarded. Standing on that ridge, watching an unnatural horror carve a straight path toward everything we had built, I began to suspect it meant something worse. I suspected we were never meant to survive long enough to become a problem worth explaining. There was no time to dwell on that theory. The creature was close enough now that the ground trembled with every step it took, and our camp, our people, sat directly in its path. I called everyone together. Every species, every camp that had drifted into our loose alliance over the past 3 weeks. And I told them the truth. We could not outrun this thing. We could not fight it with strength alone, because nothing any of us had would even scratch it. What we could do was use the one advantage none of the other creatures on this planet had ever needed us to use. We could think. I laid out a plan using the terrain I had spent 3 weeks mapping without even realizing why I was doing it. There was a ravine 2 miles east, narrow at the entrance and steep-walled, the kind of place that funneled anything moving through it into a single line. If we could draw the creature there, if we could collapse the loose rock walls at the right moment, we might be able to bury it, or at least slow it long enough to escape beyond its reach for good. It was not a perfect plan. I told them that honestly, because I had learned early that false confidence killed faster than honest uncertainty. But it was the only plan we had, and every hour we waited, the creature closed the distance. Threx volunteered to lead the bait group, using his size and speed to draw the creature's attention toward the ravine entrance. Kalos organized the exiles with military experience into a rear line, ready to redirect anyone who strayed from the path. Priya worked with 2 engineers from her original crash site to rig loose boulders along the ravine walls with makeshift levers, ready to bring them down the instant the creature was deep enough inside. My job was the part nobody else wanted, and the part I was, admittedly, most suited for. I had to stay close enough to the creature to judge its speed and adjust the plan in real time. Close enough that one miscalculation would end everything before it began. We moved into position as the sun dropped low, painting the valley in long orange shadows that made the ground hard to read. The creature's steady, mechanical footsteps grew louder with every minute, until finally its shape broke through the tree line at the far end of the valley, exactly where I had predicted. Threx and his group broke from cover, shouting, throwing burning branches to draw its attention. For one terrifying second, I thought the creature would ignore them entirely and continue straight through camp instead. Then it turned, slow and deliberate, and began following the noise toward the ravine. I ran parallel to its path, close enough to watch its stride, far enough to avoid its reach, counting every step the way I had counted everything since the day I landed here. The ravine entrance was close now, close enough that I could see Priya's team crouched along the upper edge, hands on their makeshift levers, waiting for my signal. The creature reached the narrow entrance and, for one heart-stopping moment, hesitated, as if some instinct or sensor deep inside it recognized the trap for what it was. I did not have time to wait for it to decide. I grabbed a burning branch from the nearest fire, ran closer than any reasonable person should have, and threw it directly into the creature's path, forcing its attention downward and forward, into the ravine, in the one direction I needed it to go. It worked. The creature surged forward into the narrow passage, chasing the flame, chasing the movement, exactly as every predator I had studied on this planet had chased movement before it. I shouted the signal, and Priya's team threw their weight against the levers. The ravine walls, weakened over hours of careful digging and prying, gave way all at once, sending tons of loose rock and earth crashing down around the creature in a roar that drowned out every other sound in the valley. Dust billowed up in a wall so thick I lost sight of everything for several long seconds, my heart hammering against my ribs as I waited to see if the plan had worked, or if I had just spent everyone's last resource on nothing. When the dust finally settled, the creature was buried to its shoulders, thrashing weakly against tons of rock, its strange metallic movements slowing with every passing second until, finally, they stopped entirely. Nobody cheered. We were all too exhausted, too stunned by how close it had come to failing, to do anything but stand there in silence, staring at the still shape half buried in the ravine. Threx was the first to break the silence, turning to look at me with an expression I had never seen on his face before. It was not fear, and it was not the dismissive amusement from that very first day. It was something closer to respect, the kind that could not be faked or forced. Kalos said nothing at first either, but he walked over slowly, stood beside me, and placed one heavy hand on my shoulder, a gesture I later learned meant something significant among his people, something reserved for those who had proven themselves in ways strength alone could never measure. In the days that followed, word of what happened in that valley spread further than anything before it, reaching crash sites and scattered camps I had not even known existed. Exiles who had spent weeks avoiding one another out of fear or old habits from their former empires began drifting toward our camp instead, drawn not by promises of safety, because nobody could promise that on this world, but by the simple fact that we had survived something that should have been impossible. 1 month after the pod first tore open and dumped me into red grass and chaos, I stood on the same ridge where I had first watched that creature approach, looking down instead at a settlement that had grown into something almost unrecognizable from those first desperate days. Filtered water ran through channels dug by hands from 6 different species. Warning systems ringed the perimeter, refined and improved by minds that had once dismissed careful planning as weakness. Fires burned in a wide circle at the center of camp, and around them sat exiles who, a month ago, would never have shared a meal, let alone a home. Threx sat near the largest fire, teaching 2 younger exiles how to read the migration patterns I had first sketched into the dirt weeks earlier. Priya had built a proper filtration system from salvaged pod parts, one that no longer needed constant supervision. Kalos led patrols along the perimeter with the same discipline he once reserved only for soldiers he respected, except now those patrols included creatures from species his old empire had considered beneath notice. Nobody called me exile anymore. I had heard, more than once now, the word they used instead, spoken in accents and languages that had nothing in common except the respect behind them. Leader. Not because I could outfight anything on this planet, because I could not even close, but because when everything around us seemed designed to make thinking pointless and strength the only currency that mattered, I had refused to accept that as the only rule worth following. I thought often, in quiet moments by the fire, about the Confederation officials who had signed my exile papers, who had looked at a maintenance technician with no combat record and no natural advantages, and decided I was worth less than the cost of proper transport. I wondered if they had ever imagined, even for a moment, that the world they used to erase inconvenient people might instead become the place where one of us finally proved what a human could build with nothing but patience, curiosity, and the simple refusal to stop trying. Somewhere far above the atmosphere of this planet, unseen and unheard, an old observation drone that had been left behind decades earlier to record the deaths of forgotten exiles picked up something it had not detected in years. A signal, steady, deliberate, and growing stronger by the day, coming from a settlement that was never supposed to exist this long, built by people who were never supposed to survive at all. It began recording.